Good morning, everyone, and welcome along to this morning's webinar. We're delighted to have Fran Bennett, Honorary Researcher from Oxford University and member of the Policy Advisory Group and the Women's Budget Group, along to do the webinar for us this morning. Fran has also had a long career working in and around the issues of low pay and the living wage. And I was delighted to have Fran agree to do this webinar because it really ties in with some of the work which the NERI is involved in at the minute, and looking at our social security systems and looking at the future of social welfare, and in particular to a piece of work I'm doing at the minute, which is trying to look at living standards and the relative roles of individuals, employers and government in ensuring households have appropriate or adequate living standards. So many of the things that Fran talks about in her work, I draw on all the time in my research. As well as that, we have Micheál Collins from UCD along to be a discussant or a respondent to Fran's presentation here this morning. We really like having the format of having a speaker and then a respondent, because in the webinar world, I think it allows for a more open, engaging discussion at the end of it, rather than the more stiff Q&A bit. But as we move between Fran and Micheál, so Fran's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to move on to Micheál's presentation. He's going to do a formal response with slides and so on. Feel free to put questions into the Q&A function. And at the end of the discussion, I'll prompt a discussion between Fran and Micheál, drawing on some of the things that they've discussed, but also then posing them any questions that you might have as audience members. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Fran. I have Fran present her presentation. So thanks very much, everybody, for attending this morning.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'll start off. So I'm going to be talking about low pay and the living wage, and looking at the issues that arise in terms of both low pay and in-work poverty, definitions, differences between them, recent research, and then look at the living wage both in the UK and in Ireland. And then go a bit deeper into some of the issues of both low pay and in-work poverty after that, before I conclude. Thanks, Lisa. Next slide, thank you. Cheers. So low pay is usually measured in relation to the gross hourly wage. Sorry, one back, if that's possible, Lisa. Or two back, I think. That's it. Yeah, great. So low pay is usually measured in terms of the gross hourly wage for the individual. And it's often defined, particularly by trade unions, as below a certain percentage of the median wage, the average wage. So for example, 2/3 or 66.6% is sometimes defined as a target to get low pay up to. Now, there are some calculation issues about this, which certainly we used to discuss when I was working in a trade union. One is, should we look at just the male wage only because of the undervaluation of women's work? When we look at 2/3 of the median, for example, should we include overtime or just the basic wage, and so on? But that's the kind of way in which low pay is often looked at. And that means it's being conceptualized, it's being seen in relation to labour market rewards and the inequality of labour market rewards, rather than in terms of poverty, for example. And that means that you would get to either a collectively bargained wage floor based on that kind of target, or a statutory minimum wage. So sometimes it's a wage floor that's then made into a legal floor, and sometimes it's a statutory minimum wage. It depends on the country. So looking at the composition of low pay, the extent of low pay in a country, McKnight et al. Found out that that was related to inequalities in the labour market. So the more inequality in the labour market, the more likely that low pay is higher. And there are also issues, of course, of training and progression and so on that we can talk about later on. Also, there's more low pay in certain occupations and sectors, as you will know. Next slide, thanks, Lisa. And there are certain groups who are more likely to be in low pay, particularly women, for example, and young people, and some groups who are more likely to stay low paid. So Darcy and Finch, for example, found for the Social Mobility Commission that women were more likely to stay low paid for up to 10 years than men were. And McKnight et al. Talk about cycling as well. So not just staying on low pay for many years for some people, not everybody, but also cycling in and out of low pay and unemployment, which also tends to have a scarring effect. Other terms and conditions often go with low pay, such as insecurity, 0 hours contracts, short notice of shifts, and so on. And there may also, and certainly this is true in the UK, be bogus, if you like, self-employment. So people who are said to be working on their own account, but in fact they don't have control over their terms and conditions. In the UK, those kinds of issues have been picked up in something called the Good Work Agenda, which was set off by the Taylor Review some years ago. This government said that it was going to introduce an employment bill to deal with some of these issues. But in fact, in the Queen's speech the other day, the employment bill was not mentioned. So presumably it's going to be postponed for some time. Now, of course, doing something on low pay can be an element of anti-poverty strategy, particularly in the longer term, which I'll talk about a bit more later on. But it's only an element of that. And there's one issue, which is a particular one about low pay and an anti-poverty strategy, which is the impact of a wage rise on households in poverty. So particularly those households with children, and particularly those households who are single earner, for example, may well have means-tested benefits as well as earnings. And that means, in addition to tax and national insurance contributions, that they may not get the whole benefit of an increase in low pay. Next slide, thanks, Lisa. What about in-work poverty? Well, this is usually measured differently from low pay in relation to disposable weekly household income. So not gross hourly wage for an individual, but disposable weekly household income. And talking about workers in-work poverty, that's what they tend to do in the EU. So in the EU, they tend to say a worker is in-work poverty if they've worked 7 months or more in the year. And if they haven't, they're not counted as being in-work poverty. Whereas in the UK, what we do is look at all the people in the household. So we talk about in-work poverty affecting not only the person in employment, but also the people living with them in their household. There are also differences in the definition of work used in-work poverty. Not the 7 months or more in the year from the European Union, but in the UK, we use the ILO's definition, which is 1 hour's work in the past week or more. So our definition is much looser, if you like, about what in-work means for in-work poverty. Unlike low pay, in-work poverty tends to be conceptualized in relation to poverty rather than inequality in the labour market. So poverty meaning, for example, under 60% of median household equivalized disposable income, rather than the inequality of labour market rewards. But it's a very peculiar hybrid term, in-work poverty. So the way in which we use it in the UK, which includes people in the worker's household, it's an individual activity status it's defined by. So it's the individual who is in work, but it includes the household if it's more than one person. If it's a single person, then it's just the individual. But if they've got somebody else in the household, then it's a hybrid term because it's talking about the household's income but the individual's activity status in terms of their employment. And this is kind of obscured in the debate, certainly the debates we have in the UK, about hard-working families, working households, or even workless households. Households don't work, as Sophie Pontier, who's done a lot of work on this, always points out. Households are not an employment unit. Individuals are employment units, but the household that you live in has implications, particularly gendered implications, for your status in terms of employment activity. So it's a hybrid term which takes into account both the individual and the household. Thanks, Lisa. In terms of recent research on in-work poverty, there is certainly an overlap with low pay. So I'm by no means saying that low pay and in-work poverty do not overlap, they do. And there are some indications that that is growing, in particular as the labour market changes. But they're not quite the same issue, which I hope you've been able to see already. And one interesting thing is that the rise of two-earner couples has pushed the median household income up. And that pushes 60% of that median household income up. In other words, the poverty threshold. And therefore it's more difficult. It raises the bar for one-earner couples to escape in-work poverty. So that's one of the things that has been going on in terms of the growth of in-work poverty. By no means the only thing, but one of the things. And Marks and Nolan, when they looked at in-work poverty in the European Union, found that at the individual level, it was particularly about labour market presence. So particularly for those people who were not full-time in the labour market and didn't have a permanent labour market presence. Whereas for a household in in-work poverty, it was very much about low work intensity. So that means the people in the household not working to the full extent possible, and also single earner couples. Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies recently also found that of the single earner couples with children who were in in-work poverty, they tended to be, I think it was 85% male breadwinner single earner couples. So that's clearly one of the issues that's going on. In the UK, other issues have been implicated in in-work poverty. So housing costs going up, for example, particularly in the private sector. That means the private rented sector here. And Rod Hick and Alba Lanau did a very good study of in-work poverty in 2017. There's also inadequate support for families, particularly large families. And of course, that's been exacerbated since 2010 in the UK because of austerity and the focus on families with children in terms of social security cuts. We've just heard today that the benefit cap, which particularly affects larger families, affects 200,000 families now. And there's also, of course, the two-child limit in the UK, which means you can't claim means-tested benefits for a third child onwards, born since 2017, except with certain exceptions. So we've had the growth of inadequate support for families with children in particular in the UK. And I would argue, and I'll say a bit more about this later, that there may also be an issue of the erosion of individual benefits within a couple. So individual benefits meaning non-means tested, and in the UK, the contributory benefits like job seekers allowance and employment and support allowance, the contributory versions of those have been eroded, and it's been made more difficult to get them. And I would argue that that is also a factor in the growth of in-work poverty. Thanks, Lisa. So I wanted to look at the living wage, both in the UK and in Ireland. So this brings together, in a sense, low pay and in-work poverty. And I wanted to look at its origins, the assumptions that we make, and the current position. So there's a history of the family wage in the trade union movement, which I have to say I took part in when I was working for the GMB many years ago. So we can go into that if people are interested. The family wage was very much a male breadwinner wage to be able to support a family, including a dependent wife. We no longer calculate that, and that isn't what the living wage is. I need to make that clear. But there was that history behind it. The living wage is meant to be a wage at a level that ensures a socially acceptable or decent life. So in fact, in quite a lot of living wage interpretations, it's more than just being at the poverty level. It should be above that, an adequate minimum level of income. But Gavin Kelly of the Resolution Foundation said at one point that the living wage was under-interrogated, which I think is quite an interesting phrase. So one of the things I've been trying to do is interrogate the living wage, because I think only if we do that can we have successful campaigns to do something about both low pay and in-work poverty, which I am very committed to supporting. And in fact, people would say the living wage is the only game in town to tackle low pay at the moment. The living wage, particularly in the Anglophile countries, US, UK, Ireland, is very much the name of the game at the moment in terms of how people think of tackling low pay. So I just wanted to delve into that a bit more. So in the UK, the living wage was started off by Citizens UK, really, in East London in 2001. The Citizens UK has set up the Living Wage Foundation. So the Living Wage Foundation has been at the forefront of the living wage movement for quite some time now in the UK. We now call the voluntary living wage in the UK the real living wage for reasons I'll go into in a minute. It's calculated by the Resolution Foundation now for something called the Living Wage Commission, which is wider than just the Resolution Foundation. There are different hourly rates which are worked out for London on the one hand and the rest of the UK on the other. There are only two different rates. I'm going to leave aside any arguments about the living wage and its employment impact in terms of whether increasing low pay actually causes unemployment or doesn't. There's quite a lot of recent research on that, which tends to show that it doesn't create unemployment, but I'm not going to go into that. The reason I'm not going to is because that is relevant whether you're talking about the living wage or any other way of increasing low pay. And so personally, I don't think it's relevant to interrogating the living wage. Next slide, thanks, Lisa. So in my view, there are some conceptual and practical difficulties about the living wage in the UK. For one thing, it calls low pay poverty pay in a way. In other words, you're trying to get a decent living income from the wage. And so low pay and in-work poverty that we've been distinguishing up to now, in a way, are kind of joined together. Another issue in terms of how you calculate it is whether you calculate a living wage for one family type or whether you calculate a living wage for different family types and then average them out. And some of those family types may actually receive things like in-work benefits, and you need to decide whether to include those or not. You have to make certain assumptions for one family type, or indeed for several, about how many people are living in the household, how many workers are in those households, and how many hours each of those workers is assumed to work if you're trying to work out a living wage. Now, in the UK, we assume full-time work now. We didn't always, but we do now assume full-time work for any adult in the household of the family types we're trying to average out, which is what we do in the UK. And that avoids the kind of assumption that one adult should be dependent on another who's in the labour market. But is it the best fit for the way in which different family types actually organise their lives? And is it the best fit for the workers who are most likely to be on low pay? Well, those are rather different issues, I think. The Living Wage Foundation, in fact, is now campaigning on what it calls living hours, because basically what it has said publicly now is a living wage which is worked out per hour is all very well, but whether you've actually got an adequate income depends on how many hours of work you work in the week as well. And it's trying to get employers to provide what it calls living hours in order for the wage to be sufficient for people not just in terms of the amount per hour, but in terms of the hours that employers provide for people to work. Thanks, Lisa. So in-work benefits are often included in the calculation of the living wage. That may be affected, therefore, by government action on tax and benefits in terms of what living wage you get to, in terms of the total. In the UK, it's based on the minimum income standard, and that includes costs of various items. And a cap is applied to the increase. So if the increase is going to be a lot more than the average increase in wages for the population of workers as a whole, then there's a cap applied. So there's a reference rate of the living wage, and then there's the actual living wage suggested, which is after the cap is applied to it. Now, this is why we call the living wage the real living wage in the UK, because in fact, George Osborne introduced something which he called the national living wage in April 2016. And that's for people aged 25 plus. Or it was then, it's going down the age groups. But it's a higher national minimum wage. So in fact, it is not calculated, the official government national living wage is not calculated as a living wage at all. Their goal is to reach 2/3 of median earnings by 2024. So it's a renamed statutory minimum wage. And that's therefore now why we call the voluntary living wage, which is higher usually than the national living wage, we call that the real living wage, because that's the one that employers take up voluntarily rather than it being statutory as the national living wage now is in the UK. Thanks, Lisa. So what about the living wage in Ireland? Well, clearly I don't know as much about this as a lot of people who'll be listening to this, and Micheál, who's going to do the comments in a minute. So I'll be very quick. And he has traced the background to the living wage in something he wrote in 2014. The Low Pay Commission is now investigating this possibility for the government. But although it talks about the living wage, it also mentions in the same breath almost a percentage of the median. So just like in the UK, the two things seem to be being equated. The current calculation of the living wage, which of course is not the government at the moment, talks about full-time work. It assumes full-time work of 39 hours a week. It assumes private rented housing, as I understand it. It assumes employed adults with no dependents, and looks in particular at a one adult household, although family living income is actually calculated for some other kinds of families as well, including the kinds of social supports that I was talking about just now. It's also based on consensual budget standards, just like the UK living wage, the minimum essential standard of living. And from 2020, again, as I understand it, the basket of goods which is used for that is going to be updated annually, which I think is a very good idea. Different costs in 4 areas are average. So this is different from the UK, which has just London and the rest of the UK. In Ireland, the different costs in the 4 areas are averaged and weighted by the percentage of the labour force in each area. Again, as I understand it, Micheál will tell me if I'm wrong, I'm sure. And again, there's a cap on the increase in relation to increases in private sector hourly pay, and that is kept under review. So it's kind of quite similar, but slightly different, in particular in terms of the one adult household. That's different from the UK's averaging. The 2020 living wage is €12.30, and again, as I understand it, the 2021 rate is due to be announced soon. Thanks, Lisa. So just, I'm going to go through these quite quickly because I don't want to go on for too long, but just disentangling some kind of key issues that we might be interested in if we're interested in both low pay and in-work poverty. One of these, you may not be surprised to hear, I think, is the need for a gender analysis. And there's a kind of gender paradox, which is women are particularly likely to be low paid, but are not necessarily the ones who are most likely to be in work poverty, if you look at that as a household level. And the issues arising also tend to be gendered in terms of low pay, particularly for women, but also low work intensity in the household is often to do with the gender division of labour. So the significance of your work characteristics and your situation actually depends on who you live with and your role. You would say for in-work poverty, and I suspect that is also true, well, I think that is also true for low pay. I said I would come on to this again. I think social protection for partners in households in work poverty is particularly important. And I wrote about this with Holly Sutherland. In work poverty would be reduced for couples in particular if you had more in terms of non-means tested individually based benefits for those out of the labour market. And lack of childcare provision and lone parenthood are clearly relevant both to low pay and to in-work poverty. Thanks, Lisa. So thinking about in-work poverty first, there's obviously an overlap between the individual and the household for single childless people, but otherwise, whose situation is foregrounded if we say in-work poverty? And what kinds of income are seen as key in that household? I think if we talk about in-work poverty, the policy attention goes on the earner and their earnings only. So what we think about is tackling low pay, perhaps, but also supplementing the pay so that the household income is sufficient for in-work poverty. So then we're into the idea of in-work benefits, for example. But of course, low pay and poverty are not always the same, as we've said already. And in fact, in-work supplements, although they are often criticised for supplementing low pay and also for ensuring low pay stays low because they may be subsidising the employer paying low pay, my own view is that that may also subsidise low work intensity, if you like. So you are paying for a household in which one person may be in work and one person may be out of employment. Thanks, Lisa. In other words, in-work benefits may act as a disincentive to second earners who are more sensitive to incentives, we know, than main earners often are. And of course, other things like joint taxation, transferable tax allowances, dependent spouse allowances in the tax system and so on, have a similar impact, although we're not particularly talking about those today. So if we think about access to independent income as important, then reforms to those systems, I think, are needed in terms of in-work poverty. But the thinking, when you think about second earners, may not actually go beyond a fairly general emphasis on conditionality and welfare to work and so on. What we need, I think, is considering the gender dimension more in make work pay policies and the issues that are particularly important for second earners. Thanks, Lisa. And if we're thinking about low pay, well, the majority in employment with hourly pay under 50% of the median in nearly all EU countries are women, with many of those being part-time. Young people also have a disproportionate share of low pay, but the people who are low paid long-term, as I said earlier, tend to be women, particularly after they have had children. The Dayton Review of Inequalities, by the way, is looking at this at the moment, and they will be coming out with a paper on gender inequalities, particularly gendered pay in the labour market shortly. So the traditional argument, particularly within the family wage, which I said I wouldn't go on about, was that second earners' low pay wasn't important because it was pin money, it was just an extra. But of course, it does help prevent in-work household poverty. So there are far fewer households in-work poverty if they have two earners, particularly if at least one of those is full-time. But, and this I think is particularly important, low pay also matters for the individual. So we're not just concerned about women's low pay or second earners low pay or lone parents low pay because of in-work poverty. We're concerned about it because of looking at the individual over the life course, rather than just the household they happen to be living in at the moment. Thanks, Lisa. So lastly, in terms of issues, social protection issues, I've already talked about out of work benefits being important to in-work poverty, which sounds paradoxical, but I think is important and has not been looked at sufficiently by others. And more means testing, therefore, rather than individually based benefits, has a gender dimension in terms of unemployment benefits, but also in terms of sickness benefits, and maternity, paternity, parental and care leave are also important for those individually based access to independent income within households. So the significance of low work intensity doesn't just stop at employment. It actually means if there is low work intensity in the household, should there be a benefit for the person who is out of employment at the moment? And if so, what is that benefit like? Is it individual? Can it help prevent in-work poverty? There's also, of course, the inadequacy of benefits for children and housing and childcare costs, which I haven't mentioned yet, which are included in the important issues for in-work poverty. And one of the points which people have made a lot about the living wage, and which I think is really important for us to think about, is that migrants may not qualify for a range of benefits. So all these in-work benefits and so on we've been talking about, migrants may not qualify for those. So the wage is actually critical for them. Thanks, Lisa. So in conclusion, in terms of in-work poverty, I think wages have a role, but there are other policy instruments which are important as well. Individual taxation, not joint, less emphasis on means-tested in-work benefits. Wages, of course, take no account of family size, so benefits for children are incredibly important, particularly in the UK. Child benefit has lost a quarter of its real value since 2010. And individual non-means tested social security, I've gone on about that enough. And also the employer role for workers with family responsibilities, I think. So although the wage takes no account of family size, employers, of course, can do quite a lot in terms of care leaves, parental leaves, and flexible working hours. Now, there may be a cross-party interest, I think, in work poverty. The left is particularly interested in poverty in any case. The right tends to want to make work pay and to see work as a route out of poverty. So all that means that there is a great interest across the political spectrum in work poverty. Thanks, Lisa. And then in terms of low pay, just highlighting some of the issues. This is about inequality of labour market rewards. So decent and fair wages in relation to other workers is what it's, I think it's about. It's working within a gendered labour market, of course, and that means the undervaluation of certain jobs in particular, which we need to think about. And things like employment security and progression are also important, not just low hourly pay. So, for example, in terms of public sector employment, over the austerity period in the UK, public sector employment reduced in terms of a percentage of the workforce. And that was particularly difficult for women who often progressed within the public sector to get better paid jobs and promotion and in-work training, which is on-the-job training, which is particularly important for in-work progression. In-work progression is a big focus in the UK at the moment, but something like the reduction of jobs in the public sector has worked against that, I think. So what I'm calling for in terms of low pay is a focus on the individual in a dynamic perspective over the life course and not just the household they live in at the moment. And the IFS did, Institute for Fiscal Studies, did some analysis which found that those people who find work most costly often live in poverty in later life. So it's a longer term issue, and they particularly highlighted lone parents in that context. So they might have lifelong poverty if they found earning quite difficult. And Tanya Burkhardt, of course, has also talked about time poverty for lone parents. So it's more difficult for them to increase their hours of work because they also have so much of the caring responsibility. There may also be cross-party interest in low pay, of course. The left would focus on the role of the employer and their perhaps newfound interest in pre-distribution and not redistribution. On the right, there's more interest in the supply side rather than the demand side of the labour market, and rewards from work being more important than so-called welfare, often for the right. I think it will be interesting to see what happens in the post-pandemic period, which we might want to talk about a bit in the discussion. Will there be more emphasis on trying to get people into the labour market? So a lot of employment support, conditionality, and so on. Or will there be more interest in trying to increase the rewards within the labour market in order to attract people into work after the pandemic-induced recession? Thank you very much, everybody, and I look forward to the discussion. I have included some references, and those appear at the end of the slides. So if the Nevin Economic Research Institute wants to share the slides, I'm very happy for them to do that. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Fran, and I think I am expected to come in straight away. It's firstly for me a pleasure to respond to your presentation. I'm going to share my screen to do that first. At the outset, can I say thanks to Lisa and to the Nevin Economic Research Institute for the opportunity to come back and contribute to the seminar or webinar series. I was asked to make a brief response, and that might assist in developing some points and teeing up some questions following the remarks of Fran. So I'm going to do that quickly, just initially through thanking Fran and picking up on a couple of the points that she made, and then briefly to paint and sketch a picture around low pay in the Republic of Ireland, the living wage here, what the living wage is and is not, I thought might be a point that's worth mentioning, and the tail end then looking forward to where things are going or might go on that front over the next couple of years. But first, let me start with a note of thanks to Fran for her really excellent and stimulating presentation. She covered a lot of ground historically. She covered a lot of ground in terms of the policy challenges and the policy context that face these twin issues of and related issues of low pay and the living wage. And I suppose in a sense for me, just to pick a few of the things that jumped out, I really liked that phrase of households don't work, individuals do, as a really important focus that we should have and should bring to when we're thinking about many of these issues. But of course, households, the household context for individuals has huge implications on their choices, on their options, and indeed on their outcomes. Related, I suppose, the gender lens is something we can't forget either in the context of a gendered labour market, the dominance of male breadwinner households in particular parts of the earnings and incomes distribution, and therefore the relevance of of many things, including the social protection system and social protection supports for those individuals and families. A third, I suppose, is a kind of interesting juxtaposition between certainly in the UK, between policies to raise pay, which in a sense one arm of government has been driving, yet simultaneously policies to undermine the living standards and the social safety net available to the lowest income households who in a sense are possibly improving and disimproving all at the same time, and many of them aren't lucky enough to be in the improving boat or any aspect of it. And that kind of juxtaposition is, I know, is being those lines have been joined up more and more by the social policy community in the UK, and it's so important that they are, and that the complete picture for individuals isn't forgotten. I also liked Fran's point, I think it was quoting somebody from the Resolution Foundation, that the living wage is under-interrogated. I think that's actually a very fair point, and it's often lonely territory in Ireland. I'll come back to that point in a minute, although there's a bit more interest, thankfully, now as well. And I think also the other thing, or one of the other things that struck me, is how we, in a sense, have little enough insight into those individuals who live in low pay in the long term. And it's really a gap in our knowledge and understanding of low pay. In a sense, we know who's in low pay at a particular point in time. We make assumptions about people drifting in and out of low pay. We make assumptions about younger people passing through low pay on their way to higher earnings. But I suppose, just like poverty and so many other things, it's those who are caught in that position for a long period that really should be ringing the alarm bells for us socially and politically. And we don't know enough about that. We know a little about what Fran referred to as the cycling, people coming in and out of low pay. We, of course, know there's a notable gendered aspect to that. And also, I suppose, welcome growing insights into the scarring impacts of low pay over people's lifetimes as well, particularly for women. Fran's mention of the forthcoming paper from the Dayton Commission on Inequality, I think, will be interesting in all of those contexts. And I suppose apropos of all that too, I should say that I'm, courtesy of some funding from the Low Pay Commission here in Ireland, have been doing some work, and it's coming to an end now, on looking at low pay among older workers, which is attempting to pick up on some of those aspects, both qualitatively and quantitatively, and more to come on that later in the year. For me, just to kind of maybe sketch more broadly the Republic of Ireland picture in terms of low pay, there's nothing new for many of you on this, but let's look at it anyway. 1 in every 4 workers are classified as low pay. 24% of the labour force. Is really dramatically high number. I'll come back to that in a second. Of course, it's gendered. Again, something I'll return to. Concentrated in particular low wage sectors of the economy, and those two, gender and sector concentrations, of course, go together. And concentrated in the age groups as well, so quite common, or much more common in among younger age workers. But that's important that we don't get distracted by that, because of course low pay persists across the life cycle, and therefore, in a sense, speaks and points towards some of those experiences of individuals who are persistently in low pay or cycling between low pay and unemployment. In Ireland, we like to look around for things that we're really good at or that we do well in international terms. Well, low pay is one of those. We're at the top of the international rankings for quite some time on low pay. This is data from the OECD for 2017. It looks at low pay as a proportion of median earnings. So with all the critiques that Fran rightly pointed out for that figure. But the Irish figure then was at 23% of full-time workers who were in low pay. It's worse in America, it's worse in Latvia, but in any other of the OECD countries, I couldn't fit them all into the graph, the position is better. That's quite stark, actually, that it is such a, that low pay is such a pronounced issue in the Irish labour market. And that you could, in normal times, hop on a plane and go to other European countries and look around you, and the prevalence of low pay, if you go to the very bottom of the list, the Belgiums and the Finlands and the Italies and the Denmarks and the France, is far, far less common. It's quite a pronounced difference, and it's something we shouldn't forget. And of course, when you drill down through that data, there's a very gendered picture to it as well. The blue line looks at the overall rate of low pay among full-time workers over time since 2000. And then on either side of that, the gender breakdown, lower for males and higher for females. Nothing surprising in terms of that, but just underscoring that gendered aspect of it as well. For the living wage, and for the living wage in Ireland, Fran has summarised this very well, so I'll be brief on this. It's something, I suppose, in terms of its emergence in Ireland, comes from from minimum income standards research. The Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice has been undertaking for a long time, and we worked together on a report in 2011. Where we, at the tail end of that report, started to talk about the potential to use that research for a living wage. I have to say, most people were relatively uncomfortable with that idea at the time, but there's been a kind of slow growth of it since. I'd sort of describe it as from really quite limited interest in living wages. I remember people giving out to me for talking about living wages when that report was launched, to widespread endorsement of the idea and recognition of it. And indeed, the growth of it and the adoption of it as a concept, whatever about its implementation, is something that's been very satisfying rather to see over the last couple of years. Yeah, widespread endorsement, but perhaps not widespread adoption, and that's another issue which I might return to in a second. I and others are members of the Living Wage Technical Group, and so we are a group who, I always say the meetings of the Living Wage Technical Group are as boring as they sound, but we sit down to crunch the numbers and produce on an annual basis the updated figure for the living wage, and have been doing that since 2014. It emerged out of papers the Vincentians authored, and I, while working at the NERI, authored as well. And we've built into that then a kind of a clear evidence-based approach for calculating and determining what the living wage is. Here's a picture of it over time then, from when it started off 1145 in 2014, and that's sort of grown over time. It flatlined in 2019 into 2020 into 2021. It's at €12.30 per hour. Why did it go up? Well, it went up because living costs went up, and it's linked to changes in living costs. And there's far more information on the livingwage.ie website, which has this document, that very short 4-page summary document, which is updated every year, and a very more detailed technical report outlining how the living wage is calculated. Robert Thornton, who's the one of the researchers at the Vincentian Partnership, summed it up rather nicely. I just took a clip of the way he did that for the Irish living wage. It's based on the idea of an adequate income, a point I'll come back to in a minute. It's evidence-based, so it's built upon a data foundation. It's transparent in terms of its calculation, so it's there and it's available for people to see and see where it comes from. And then we update it on an annual basis as well. We've been updating it in July. We've shifted that to a September update, so the next one will appear in September. And the logic is that it's put out in place so that individuals and employers have the information in time for implementation a couple of months later. What the living wage is, well, I always answer that with by saying the living wage is the answer to a question, at least the way which it's been calculated in Ireland. And the question is, what is the minimum hourly rate of pay a single full-time worker should receive to be able to afford a basic but decent standard of living? Now, that means really it's about income adequacy. But that's quite a complex question, actually, and therefore there's an awful lot of detail behind it to produce an answer. It's also not a perfect measure, reflecting some of the points that Fran made as she discussed. Not everybody is single, not everybody is or can be a full-time worker. There are issues around the definition of basic but decent standards of living, although there's a very transparent justification of that from the minimum essential standards of living budget standards research. And indeed, there's a kind of a challenge here in that you were talking about an adequate hourly rate of pay, but of course it is the cumulative experience of those across a working week that gives people standards of living, that idea of, or that drives people standards of living rather, that idea that the Resolution Foundation was mentioned from them in Fran's presentation earlier, of living hours is really important. You know, having 4 or 5 hours a week well paid isn't particularly much good. It is the steadiness and the steadiness of well-paid or reasonably paid employment that's important in terms of people's living standards, and of course the predictability of that as well. What the living wage is not, I think, is probably also worth pointing out. It's not a panacea, is the first thing, and we always have to be very careful of deciding not to, or, you know, in a sense, critiquing steps forward on the basis that they don't solve all problems. So the living wage will not, cannot, and should not be seen as solving all problems, but it is really fundamentally about income adequacy and our earnings adequacy, and fundamentally about ensuring that individuals should get at least a particular amount of hourly wages for their labor. I suppose when we think about it, it will address income adequacy through giving lower paid workers higher earnings and higher take-home pay, but it is not going to solve lots of other issues. It's not going to resolve the gendered inequality in the labour market. Indeed, there's that great paradox there that while there are more low-paid women, actually men work more hours among the low-paid, and so an hourly increase in low pay will benefit men more than women, and may indeed actually widen gender inequality gaps. Is that a reason for not doing it? I don't think so, but it's not something we shouldn't be oblivious to. It won't solve poverty issues, even in-work poverty issues, because as Fran pointed out, there's a lot more going on there in terms of the dynamics of individuals' living conditions and the households that they live in, and the choices which they do or do not have, which are framed by so many other aspects of policy and society as well. And it won't solve the divides in income, or indeed the divides in earnings inequality that we've seen open up, in particular on the earnings side, over the last decade or two. It will help in terms of addressing issues at the bottom, but there's other actions need to be taken if we're going to society seriously address those direct income and earnings inequality issues. It's also not a burden on employers, and I think that's important as well. The evidence points towards reductions in turnover of staff and productivity benefits in return for a more stable workforce, and in return for the higher pay that they're receiving. So there are employer benefits. So a wage bill goes up, but other bills will fall as well. Yes, perhaps some prices will have to rise in certain sectors so that the employees working in those sectors can be paid a little bit more, but we're not talking about substantial price rises. And in reality, you know, we either want to embrace decent wages for individuals or not, and part of the embracing of that is a reality that some prices in some sectors will have to marginally rise to reflect it. And finally, looking forward, I suppose, you know, issues around low pay and issues around the living wage are in vogue at last, and I think that's a very good thing. I think the pandemic has further assisted in shining a light on the issue of low pay. We realized very rapidly as the pandemic unfolded about how important the roles of low-paid workers are in the maintaining of the standards of living in the most broadly defined way of our societies. They became central rather than marginal, and that transformation isn't something we should forget. There'll be an annual update to the Irish living wage in September. It strikes me as a sort of issue. It's something that needs greater support. You know, there's a few of us who voluntarily undertake it and do it. It's run on, to describe it as being run on a shoestring would be to overestimate and exaggerate the resources that it gets, other than voluntary resources from those who work on it. I think there is a danger of a sort of non-evidence-based living wage emerging, one that's just benchmarked against something else and that loses the link between living costs and living standards, which is so fundamental to the concept of the living wage. And of course, that's been the experience in the UK as well. It strikes me it needs a campaign. Those of us who are on the living wage technical group are there to do the technical work. We're not a campaigning organization, but I think there is merits in that, and it would be nicer to see more people pushing and pressing for its adoption. It'd be nice to see it adopted more by local government, particularly for the contractors that they employ. Generally, local government earnings are above the living wage, but their contractors often are not. Similarly for trade unions and the NGO sector as well. And there's a case to be made for living wage accreditation in Ireland, that, for example, like the Living Wage Foundation that was mentioned in the UK, and there are similar other bodies internationally to do that role as well. It's certainly something we should consider. I think also politicians are discovering that it's hard to be against the living wage, and that applies whether you're in this country or whether you're in other parts of the world as well. And there's the image from the Living Wage website at the moment, and an insight into the members of the Living Wage technical group, or where they come from underneath it as well. So Lisa, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Really interesting from both of you. I'm going to hold myself back for a minute or two until we get some of the Q&As from the box to ask some of the questions that I have that kind of overlap, I suppose, both your presentations. But I'll start with just kind of the broad questions that have been coming up in the Q&A function time and time. And that's Fran and Micheál. You know, I'm happy for you both to chip in and the Q&As, but that's about considering the role of universal basic income as a way to address these issues and issues to do with income adequacy and independent income.
Do you want me to start on that, Lisa?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, yeah, universal basic income. I mean, just to be clear, because occasionally it's used, I think, wrongly. Universal basic income is individual, not based on household. It's non-means tested. It's unconditional, so you don't have to sign on or whatever, and it's not taxable. That's how I understand universal basic income. So I hope we're talking about the same thing. And there is quite a lot of movement towards universal basic income in the UK, as I think there is elsewhere. Compass, for example, in the UK, which is a kind of centre-left pressure group, is very interested in it. And there are local movements towards universal basic income. Wales is going to pilot it. There are some pilots in individual local areas in England as well, also in Scotland. I'm not sure about Northern Ireland. That's the one I don't know about. So it is very much of the moment. And at the beginning of the pandemic, there were some calls for an emergency universal basic income for everybody to help with the effects of the pandemic. The only condition that is usually put on universal basic income, and this is not much talked about, but it does usually have a residence condition. You have to have been in the country for a certain time in order to get it. That's what the campaign has said in the past. It's very interesting, and particularly that was picked up on by what Lisa said of the questions, I think, in terms of it being, if you like, independent access to income, which I've said I'm very much in favour of. I think that the people who are campaigning for it are largely concerned about security in work, Not so much about what it might do for people out of work, apart from the conditionality issue, getting rid of conditionality perhaps. The Commission on Social Security in the UK, which is led by people who have experience of benefits, has just come up with a very different idea, which is a minimum income guarantee, which would still be, as I understand it, means tested. So it tends to be people who are particularly concerned about the developments in the labour market and what universal basic income might do about that. So it would give you a floor of income that you could build on, if you like. And some people think that would also tilt the balance in terms of negotiation between workers and employers. So it's incredibly interesting in all sorts of ways. A lot of people who have looked at it, there's been some very good work done by the University of Bath recently. There's obviously Citizens Income Organisation and so on. But a lot of the work that's been done has concluded, I think, that it would be difficult to introduce a universal basic income at a level which would meet needs in full. And therefore, quite often, what we may be talking about is a partial basic income. So, for example, the New Economics Foundation recently in the UK came up with the idea of abolishing the personal tax allowance and replacing it with a partial basic income worth 40 something pounds a week for everybody. Now, that wouldn't mean you could live on it, but it would be a start, if you like. So a partial basic income, I think, is more likely to be the kind of thing we might be looking at. And that made me realize recently in a kind of blinding flash that actually that means that you have to keep on talking about the conditions for other benefits, because it's not going to be a full benefit for anybody, sorry. And therefore you have to keep on thinking about, should we also have benefits which are conditional on signing on for work or signing off work for sickness? Should we also have benefits which are means tested or non-means tested, individually based or jointly based? It doesn't solve all the problems about benefits. So that's one of the things that I think is important. The other issue that I am somewhat concerned about is that we know from the cash for care benefits in some countries in the European Union that the only people who tend to exit the labour market, if they are given a low income from the state with no right to return to employment, tend to be women caring for other people. So there is a bit of an issue about universal basic income and gender, which goes two ways, I think. One is, yes, it gives an individual income. It gives independent access to income. But those people who say that it's a payment for caring and a recognition of caring, I'm not sure I agree with that, because it's basically a payment for existing. It's like child benefit, but for adults. So I don't see it as a payment that recognises the value of caring. And it is possible that it could lead to more labour market exit in the longer term, as opposed to those benefits which give parental leave benefit, for example, but include a right to return to employment afterwards. That's rather a long answer, but I think universal basic income is so interesting in terms of both pros, and I would have to say cons as well, I think, that it is worth a proper discussion.
Yeah, Lisa, and I'll briefly come in there after that. It's interesting to see that question pop up, and it is sort of in vogue as well, which reflects the focus on it from the questions too. I suppose firstly, they really are two different things, and we should remember that. So a living wage is about providing an earnings floor, and so it is about saying, if you go out to work and you provide an hour's labor, that you will get a certain minimum for that. And okay, there's there's an assumption here that then if you multiply that up by working full-time and so on, it will allow you sufficient to have a fairly basic but decent standard of living. By the way, the basic but decent standard of living, which is defined in the various technical reports and so on, and in much more detail by the Vincentian Partnership in their work here, and in similar budget standards work in the UK and elsewhere, is pretty basic and pretty decent when you dig into it as well. So it's not by any manner means luxurious, but it's about ensuring that you're able to do that. And so that's what the living wage is. Whereas what universal basic income isn't entirely unrelated, but it's about an income floor. And indeed, reflecting the comments that Fran mentioned along the way, they're two very different things. And so an income floor is just providing individuals, irrespective of whether they're in the labour market or otherwise, irrespective of their entries in and out of the labour market and so on, it's providing them with a floor upon which they can stand and build from. And I suppose that the real core and logic of that is the opportunities that it provides to individuals, the disadvantages that it has the potential to set aside from that as well. I also agree that in terms of being able to afford this, it's likely that states will have to go down if they're going down that route, it will be a partial route. Firstly, there are kind of some easy things you could do through transforming the transfers in the taxation and aspects of the welfare system into a basic income and work from there. But we should also not see that as a panacea, seeing as I'm using that phrase today too, and be careful not to kind of set up universal basic income as something that's going to solve all problems. It won't, nor will the living wage. But if you judge the living wage from the perspective of providing a basic, decent earnings floor, and if you judge the basic income as providing a basic income floor, from which in both cases individuals can build from, well, those are good objectives to pursue, and I think those are the strong arguments in favor of both of those things.
Very good. It's a related point, but it moves away from this discussion about universal basic income into something that's becoming increasingly talked about, particularly in the Irish context, is the universal basic services. So Nessun Vaughan is wondering, is there any comments about the validity of looking at the living wage, I suppose the calculation of the living wage, alongside that access to basic services and the interplay between the two? I suppose things like access to childcare, public transport, health, education, etc. And what impact would that have on our living wage? So happy to hear comments from both of you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And that's another really interesting one. We're getting the big questions today. Universal services. Very interesting. The New Economics Foundation does a lot on universal services. And one of the interesting things I've always found is that they have tended not to be the people who lead on universal basic income, for example, or indeed non-means tested benefits. They tend to talk about a minimum income guarantee, which is means tested. So it's quite interesting that that sort of opposition happens, and I'm not quite sure politically why or how that happens. However, just to take the question in its own right, I think the outgoings, the costs that people have to fork out for, are incredibly important in this whole discussion. So, for example, we are doing, when I say we, it's the University of Bath, and I'm working with them, are doing some research on universal credit and couples at the moment. You'll know that universal credit is the all-in-one means-tested benefit that merges 6 means-tested benefits and tax credits in the UK, and is in and out of work, like universal basic income, but very unlike it because it's not universal, it's means-tested. So you'll know that that is in the UK at the moment, and we're doing some research on universal credit and couples. And the way in which universal credit deals with childcare costs, for example, makes life very difficult for a lot of earning parents. So something like childcare costs, which is very expensive in the UK, and housing costs, which I had already mentioned in my presentation, which are going up, and which a lot more people are in the private sector now rather than social housing, and private rents are going up, but the until recently in the pandemic, the local housing allowance, the benefit for that is not going up. It's not covering housing costs for a lot of people now. All those are really, really important points. And I would be very much in favour, particularly in terms of childcare, of tackling things via the supply side rather than the demand side. So if you like, providing as much as possible free or low-cost childcare, rather than saying we have marketized childcare in the UK and we give means-tested benefits and other help towards meeting those costs. I personally think it would be a better solution to have, as you're suggesting, the questioner's suggesting, universal services which would be cost-free as far as possible. I think that's more difficult with housing, but we could certainly have a much better balance of social and private housing in the UK than we have at the moment. And social housing is not being built to the kind of scale that it needs to be to meet those demands and those needs at the moment. So I have a great deal of sympathy with this, and I think it would affect. I mean, it should affect the calculation of the living wage, because it would mean that people's costs are not as high as they used to be. So it would mean that the living wage would be lower. And one of the issues about the living wage is what impact those kinds of costs and government action on those kinds of costs has on the living wage that you're bargaining for, and how that relates to wage structures and collective bargaining and so on. I think that's an interesting issue. But in basically, I'm very much in favour, but I don't see universal services as being in opposition to either doing something about low pay or doing something about non-means tested benefits being improved.
Yeah, and I'll come in there too, Lisa, if I can. I let me just briefly echo what Fran said first, Lisa. I'm not going to repeat it because I totally agree. I suppose just to pick up on maybe a few of the calculation aspects implicit in Neston's question. As Fran just mentioned at the end there, the living wage in its calculation is linked to living costs. And so if living costs fall, well, then the living wage will fall. And one of the ways that living costs could fall is through the provision of better public services. So individuals simply don't need as much money to be able to afford a basic standard of living, because there are better public services available for them. And you can think about that in the context of transport, or you can think about that in the context of childcare for particular families. You can think about that in the context of housing, health, care as well, and so on. And therefore, when you kind of go into the calculations behind the living wage, every year, if you look at the report that the technical group produce, will show what's going up and what's going down. And for example, if you have got so transport changes in the structure of transport ticketing over the last couple of years made transport cheaper, which, if nothing else happened, would have driven the living wage down. But also we've had increases in housing costs, and because of very poor provision of social housing in Ireland, which is a whole other seminar, the assumption that is made for the living wage calculations here is that individuals are in the private rented market. And so when you've had a notable increase in private sector rents, well, then that pushes up living costs, and the living wage will rise on foot of that. If we had better, I might even say proper housing policies to address that, housing costs would fall, and it would mean that the living wage would fall as well. So there's a very fundamental link between the living wage and living costs. And again, to emphasize, it's a floor to earnings, a floor benchmarked on adequacy and benchmarked on being able to afford adequacy. Sometimes you don't have to pay for those things, or pay as much for them if they are provided by the state in a more comprehensive way. So we should see those links links there. And I suppose the final thing I'll say, and it's what's driven a real challenge for Ireland and the Irish Technical Group in getting at a living wage, is we focused it on a single individual. And one of the reasons for that was actually, if you focused it on families, say, for example, families with children, it brought in issues around childcare and the cost of childcare, which internationally is outrageously high in the UK, and we're slightly higher again. And so you get this and there is an honest question as to whether employers should have to pay for the failures of the state in terms of providing childcare. And certainly my view on that is a very strong no, that the state needs to get its act in order in terms of the provision of childcare, and increasing wages to pay individuals to be able to afford childcare, very high childcare costs that they shouldn't be paying in the first place, is a failure of the state, and we shouldn't be shoving those costs onto employers. So there's a kind of a difficult and then this brings you back to perhaps some of the very boring discussions that the Living Wage Technical Group has from time to time, but there's kind of an interesting issue around the dynamics of that, and that's actually what's left the Irish living wage as being focused on, one of the reasons it's left it being focused on single individuals, although as Fran pointed out, we're not oblivious to the fact that families face costs, and therefore we do report what families would need to earn each year to be able to afford a basic and decent standard of living. That's a much, much higher number, and it really isn't up to the labour market in and of itself to provide that, because public services and adequate public services sit at the core of that.
Can I just pick up on that point, because it gets to something, I suppose, Micheál, in the slide that you had where you're saying when people ask you what the living wage is, and you were saying the living wage is to provide a minimum hourly rate of pay to a single full-time worker, which should enable them to afford a basic but decent standard of living. And I want to pull that out in the context of what you just said and some of the things that Fran have just said about whose responsibility is it to provide a minimum basic standard of living. And because I suppose in the work that I'm doing, that's the question is different from yours, in that it's saying, what is the minimum rate, or what is the minimum rate of income which an individual should have to have a decent standard of living, and then whose responsibility is that, and the kind of the relative roles of the employer and the state there. And drawn back to what you were saying, Fran, about kind of George Osborne's move towards the national living wage at the same time as austerity was happening. So you had the freeze on benefits at the same time as there was a push being put on by government onto employers to increase the rewards in the labour market. So I'm really interested in this kind of, are we in the end doing anything about increasing or providing adequate living standards, or are we really in a tug of war here, in which the government is throwing more is thrown over to employers to provide more of the income required for a decent standard of living, and we're not actually doing anything very much to living standards at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting one, Lisa. And I mean, what happened in the UK was quite ideologically motivated. So if I can remember rightly, David Cameron's phrase was a higher wage, lower tax, lower welfare society. So it wasn't just motivated by shifting the costs from, for example, cutting back on benefits and making employers pay more in terms of wages. That could have been one motivation, because it was certainly at the time of austerity, and you know, I'm sure it was. But the other thing was ideological, in that what they wanted to do was to shift away from social security being part of the equation, really. So that they actually ended up And we're talking now about not just, there was a coalition government, then there was a Conservative government, as people will know. But they didn't just cut benefits, they actually cut taxes quite significantly. And I think I've seen some people saying that those balanced out, actually, that the amount that was given away in higher tax allowances and other tax cuts balanced out the cuts in benefits. And the cuts in benefits were particularly focused on families with children who had done well, relatively speaking, in the Labour years. There were real increases, particularly in the benefit rates for under 11s, in means tested benefits in the Labour years, as well as real increases in child benefit and so on. So the point I'm coming to is that this affects different people. Okay. So if you increase the minimum wage, which is basically what the government did, and if you increase personal tax allowances within an individual tax system, which is what the UK has got, you're basically affecting individuals. Mm-hmm. Whereas the means tested benefits, which were particularly claimed by families with children, who had people in work in their household, those means tested benefits, they were being cut, and that particularly affected households on low income, not necessarily just benefiting individuals or individuals within households on low pay, if you see what I mean. So it's not just it's not just a shift of responsibility from one unit to another, but I think it's absolutely important that you're investigating that. But it's also a shift in the impact of those policies on different groups of people. So some people gained from that and some people lost from that. And you need to be aware of that if you're rebalancing those sources of an adequate income within a society.
Yeah, very good.
And Lisa, I'll come in. I'll start by saying I think it's another big question. Our topic. I mean, let me say first, while acknowledging the ideological drive in the UK, I thought it was very interesting how at some point in time, one aspect of that agenda, just one aspect of that agenda, was a government running out of a willingness to tolerate employers paying very low wages continually to their employees, and the state having, whether adequately or not, stepping in to support that. And it's been very interesting to watch the UK from the outside over the last while, where those low wages have been driven up, and it has had impacts on the labour market and on technology and all sorts of other things too. But simply, for the most part, employers have got on with paying higher wages to their low-paid staff. They're still low-paid staff, but they're paid a bit more than they did before. And the Armageddon of that would have been promised or projected for paying for, notably in proportional terms at least, increasing the pay of those workers hasn't unfolded. And we shouldn't forget that when we come across other arguments to say that we should pay low-paid employees a little bit more for their hourly wages. I look forward to your report, Lisa, which answers the very big question that you asked us. I suppose, again, I mean, the really simple answer for me, a very simplistic answer for me to that question, is that it is society's role to provide these basic living standards for everybody, and that means it's all of us. And so it isn't one aspect of society, it isn't just government, and clearly there's a role for government in the context of maybe legislation around certain things, the provision of public services, clearly of welfare supports too, but there's equally a role for employers in terms of the provision of adequate pay and of decent working conditions associated with that. There's a role for the trade union movement and other bodies bodies around the ensuring that workers are able to avail of those and protecting those entitlements for workers as well. So it's a very broad suite of things, and we should see them as sort of collectively working to move forward. What I would say, though, is that the minimum living standard is the same for everybody. And it doesn't matter what you earn, it doesn't matter whether it's a tiny amount or a massive amount, the minimum is the same for everybody. Some people are fortunate, most of us are fortunate to be living at multiples of the minimum and not really have to worry too much about what that minimum is. But there are many people who are struggling to get to the minimum, but it's the same for everybody. And I think the pandemic actually has helped a little bit in highlighting the vulnerabilities of our societies. Things can change rather rapidly overnight, and those who are not vulnerable can end up being vulnerable very rapidly without them ever expecting or anticipating that they could end up in such a place. And in that sense, we all have a role to play in providing a basic minimum for everybody and ensuring whether it's services, whether it's income, whether it's earnings, that there's a basic minimum floor below which nobody can or should fall.
In that respect, actually, it was a piece of work from the Resolution Foundation commenting on the universal basic income argument in the context of COVID, which struck me, which said, if we had a universal basic income throughout COVID, what impact would it have actually had on those who were hit with vulnerabilities? Because people like me who kept my job weren't hit with that vulnerability, and I would have continued to get the universal basic income, and implications that would have on the state's ability to be able to give money to those who were faced with vulnerabilities. I thought it was a really good example of the universal basic income providing for vulnerabilities. Fran, finally, I just want to pick up if I can, because I think it's interesting and for some of the audience that we have here today, on what you said at the start about your role within the trade union movement and kind of arguing about the family wage back at the start of your career.
Yeah.
How you might think about that now.
Okay, that's an anecdote, which is why I didn't go into it. But so I used to work, one of my first proper job really was to work for the GMB. It used to be the General Municipal Boilermakers and Allied Trade Union. And I worked there for nearly 5 years, doing social security work really. But one of the things I had to do regularly for the negotiators was to work out what a married man with a dependent wife and 2 children would get on what was then supplementary benefits. So that would be the equivalent of universal credit or income support today, means tested benefit out of work. And the negotiators would take this to the employers and they would say, look, you are paying your workers under the level which would allow them to have the same living standard as somebody who was out of work. This is terrible, you must pay them more. And the employers would turn around and say, what are you talking about? A married man with a dependent wife and 2 kids? All ours are women who are part-time. They come in the lunch break and that's what they do. They're nothing like the worker that you're talking about who's out of work with a dependent wife and 2 kids. So that's what made me realize that we were on a route to nothing, a complete dead end, with the family wage being used as a negotiating tactic, because it didn't fit the pattern of the low paid workers that the employers were talking about and were employing every day. And so myself and a group of feminists at the time, and we're talking, what are we talking, late 70s, early 80s, actually published a pamphlet about the family wage and arguing that the trade union movement shouldn't use the family wage as a negotiating tactic. And the TUC actually did change their policy in the end and didn't put that forward. Within my own union, it was resisted on the grounds that you should use every negotiating tactic you possibly could, and that you couldn't drop one of them. But it seemed to me that it was counterproductive and it wasn't having the effects that they wanted it to have in terms of influencing the employer to pay a higher wage, because the employer could just get out of it by saying, you know, family wage is irrelevant to our pin money second earners, who are the only people we employ. So that was the beginning of my interest in the kind of tensions between low pay and in-work poverty, really. I would absolutely not want to give the impression that the living wage is calculated as a family wage today. It absolutely isn't, and I would never say that. And it isn't in the UK either. And so, you know, I very carefully said the dependence issue is not raised by the way in which the living wage is calculated, either in the UK or in Ireland, actually now. But that's one of the reasons, I think, because the family wage just didn't work for people in terms of negotiating.
Yeah, very good. And finally, Micheál, because a couple of people have been asking on the Q&A about your point about kind of the Living Wage Ireland group not being a campaigning group, and they've asked, is there any kind of thoughts on how you might engage a broader group on the calculation of the living wage, including employer representatives, and if you think there's any organisations who could actually help with that campaign?
Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, it's funny. The Irish living wage evolved. I think it evolved from work that the Vincentians did and I did, and that's where it came from. So there was only two of us to start with, as it were. So I suppose it's growing over time in that, and those who. I suppose there are two different things. There's a technical group, and I think we'd be very interested in hearing from others who'd wish to join the technical group, which is about the methodology and about the calculation, and really about ensuring that if a number goes out, the €12.30, that we can stand over it. And that's really important actually for employers, and that's really important for individuals, and it's important that there's clarity around it, that it isn't a number, you know, anybody can pick a number out of thin air, as it were, but the importance is we don't do that, and that there's a basis for it, and that it's clearly linked to living standards and linked to robust calculation methods and data for that as well. So certainly if there are more nerds out there who would like to be involved in the calculation of the living wage, I'd welcome their engagement on it as well. I think there's a broader issue. So in a sense, well, I suppose we see, or certainly I see the role of the technical group as producing the number and being able to stand over that. But I think there's a bigger role out there, and it isn't really being filled, for more people to actually take that up and to say, right, we should be convincing employers, convincing government, convincing political parties and so on to go down the road of adopting and implementing the living wage. I think that's about understanding it a little bit more too. Back to my panacea point that it's not going to solve everything, but it does serve an important aspect as well. So look, I think it'd be great to see more and more of that. It's encouraging. The current program for government commits to the adoption of a living wage over its lifetime. There's investigations, as Fran mentioned, from the Living Wage Commission, the Low Pay Commission into it as well. And I think that's great to see more thinking on that. I mean, ultimately, everybody is thinking about ensuring that there are adequate levels of pay at the very bottom. There's a difference between the living wage and the minimum wage. The minimum wage is the state drawing a line saying that's the minimum. The living wage is linked to living costs and to the discussion we've just had, and meaning that those costs could fall as well as rise. And indeed, there's really strong arguments for them falling if we had better public services driving them as well. So look, I think it'd be great to hear more and more people to get involved and get engaged on that, and on a campaign around the living wage as well. The last pre-pandemic event I attended was one where the living wage technical group organized a seminar and a sort of half-day event to try and give some momentum to that, and we might post-pandemic do that again to try and get the ball rolling. It would be really good to see more and more people embrace it and involve it and push and campaign for it.
Very good. Okay, well, I'll not take up any more of your day. Thanks so much to both of you for presenting in the webinar. Really good discussion, and I look forward to further engagement with you both in the future. So thanks very much. Thanks everybody for attending. Thank you.